Russia thought that it faced no threat on the mainland when it invaded Ukraine in February 2022, and at that time it didn't. Ukraine didn't really have the weapons it needed to hit Russia, and when long-range weapons arrived from the West, Ukraine then had to deal with restrictions on their usage. A lot has changed since Russia invaded. Ukraine is now a long-range monster, and Russia's oil refineries are feeling the full force of that monster's power. Thanks to its long-range weapons, Ukraine has done the unthinkable by crippling the fuel reserves of a country that is known for its oil and gas. Russia won't recover from this for years as it grapples with the consequences of the war that Vladimir Putin started. Since 2024, Ukraine has been launching strikes against Russia's oil refineries. These facilities, which are responsible for turning crude oil into usable products such as gasoline and diesel, are inside Russia and were once thought to be out of reach for Ukraine. Not anymore. Ukraine's past refinery strikes were effective but often isolated. Russia would be able to repair its refineries, meaning no real long-term damage was done. That is yet another thing that has changed. Since August 2025, Ukraine has adapted its strategy. It's still hitting as many refineries as it can, but it no longer hits them just once. A refinery gets hit, then hit again and again, keeping it offline for a much longer period. The cumulative effect of these repeated strikes on multiple refineries has been hitting Russia hard during the second half of 2025. Now, Ukraine has hit a new milestone. 50% of Russia's refining capacity has now been hit by Ukraine. That's according to Maritime Press, which published a report on October 21st, revealing that Ukraine has hit the landmark figure. It says that Ukraine's long-range drones and missiles have scored direct hits on around half of Russia's refineries, shutting many of them down to the point where they can no longer ship their products to the rest of Russia. In a perfect world, Ukraine will be able to hit the other 50%. However, that's unlikely to happen, the outlet says, because the other half of Russia's refineries are either too far from Ukraine to be hit by drones or are already running at a reduced capacity, which means they're not priority targets. So Russia still has a good number of undamaged refineries. However, those refineries being so far away from Ukraine is a problem. To keep his war machine ticking, Putin needs to ensure that the fuel his country produces makes its way to Russia's soldiers in Ukraine as quickly as possible. Ukraine hitting every refinery that's within its range leaves only those that are far away to pick up the slack. Fuel now has to travel a far greater distance to reach Ukraine, and that's without even mentioning the impact that these strikes are having domestically or on Russia's ability to sell one of its most valuable products. Adding to Russia's woes is the repair situation. Western sanctions have caused Russia a ton of problems when trying to repair refineries, because they mean there aren't enough parts to go around. Euromaidan Press says that Russia is being forced to reroute components to the refineries that Ukraine is hitting. That means the refineries outside of Ukraine's range are going without essential maintenance work. It's degradation without direct hits. Ukraine is taking advantage of Russia's supply problems to ensure that as many of Russia's refineries are under strain as possible. And you won't need 3 guesses to figure out what Ukraine will do when Russia uses rerouted components to get a refinery back online. More strikes. Russia ends up right where it was before the repairs. As Russia's refineries burn and engineers work around the clock to get them back up and running, Russia itself is starting to show the signs of being a nation under intense pressure. The outcome of Ukraine's refinery strikes is more important than the strikes themselves, and Russia is grappling with a trio of problems that have put it on the brink of internal collapse. Fuel shipments hitting new lows is the first of those problems. Euromaidan Press reports that Russia's daily shipment rates of both crude and refined oil reached levels in September that haven't been seen since 2020. For anybody who needs a reminder, 2020 was the year that the COVID-19 pandemic kicked off, causing a collapse in global supply chains that severely impacted Russia's ability to ship oil. Back then, it was the fear of an unknown disease that caused Russia's woes. Today, thanks to Ukraine, Russia's shipments are done because it no longer has the oil and fuel to sell. That doesn't mean Russia has no oil. According to a Euromaidan report, September saw it sell about 3.69 million barrels of crude and refined oil products per day. That seems like a massive number, and it might be for a nation that doesn't rely on its oil sector to prop up its economy. This reflects a massive drop of over 26% compared to the Russian average last year. So where long strings of tank cars were once left at terminals routinely, rail moves far fewer products, and there are many fewer products available to feed export ships, Euromaidan Press says. Naturally, this means that Russia isn't generating as much money as it used to from its oil and fuel exports. On October 14th, Reuters reported that Russia's combined oil and fuel exports were down to $13.35 billion in September. Again, this is still a massive number, which shows that there's still a lot of work for Ukraine to do to truly cripple Russia's oil industry. However, $13.35 billion is over $200 million less than Russia earned from its oil in August. And August was also another declining month, as Russian revenue dropped steeply between July and August, Reuters says. The International Energy Agency, or IEA, lays the credit for these declines at the feet of Ukraine and its long-range drone assaults. Persistent attacks on Russian energy infrastructure have cut Russian crude processing by an estimated 500,000 barrels per day, resulting in domestic fuel shortages and lower product exports, Reuters reports the IEA is stating. The Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air piles on the bad news for Russia, noting that September saw the country's overall fossil fuel revenues experience a 4% month-on-month slump. Worse yet, the organization says September 2025's revenues represented a 26% reduction on what Russia earned from its fossil fuels during the same month in 2024. A decline in revenue is bad enough. When that decline is enough to make monthly fuel revenues the lowest they've been since Putin invaded Ukraine, there's only one conclusion that we can draw: Ukraine's refinery strikes are working. And that means that Russia can expect plenty more of them in the future. The first of this trio of issues is perhaps the most directly damaging to Russia's ability to wage war on Ukraine. A gradual strategy of taking out refineries to limit Russian oil and fuel sales is designed to ensure Putin has as little money as possible to pump into his Ukraine war effort. Less money means fewer soldiers and fewer pieces of equipment on the battlefield. And with refineries struggling to produce, what Russia does send won't have as much of the fuel needed to launch sustained assaults against Ukraine. But there are two more issues that Ukraine hitting 50% of Russia's refineries causes. Russia's maritime exports have also taken a massive hit, as Maritime press reports. It says that Russia's seaborne exports of refined oil products dropped by 17% in September, due to many of Russia's refineries being forced to halt processing. This shouldn't come as too much of a surprise. At the end of September, Russia extended its gasoline export ban until the end of 2025 and introduced a partial ban on the export of diesel products. With its refining capacity down, Russia is doing as much as it can to preserve fuel for its domestic markets, which is having a massive knock-on effect on the country's seaborne trade. This decline in seaborne fuel shipping goes a long way to explaining why Russia's oil and fuel revenue looks the way it does right now. However, Russia seems to have a bigger problem looming on the horizon. In addition to its refinery strikes, Ukraine has also taken aim at several of Russia's ports and loading facilities as part of its campaign to destroy Russia's energy infrastructure. For seaborne shipping, these types of strikes create risk, and with higher risk comes the demand that Russia pay more to insure its ports and ships. When port and ship calls become unreliable, insurers raise premiums to restrict cover for voyages, especially older shadow fleet tankers that sail with unclear documentation. That forces traders to hunt for scarce, more expensive insurance or switch to lower quality vessels with thin or state-backed cover, delaying shipments and raising the cost of every barrel that moves, Maritime press reports. It's the raised cost of shipping for every barrel that will concern Russia. In July, the UK and the European Union announced the implementation of a new $47.60 price cap on Russian oil. That means Russia can only earn a maximum of $47.60 for a barrel of crude when selling that oil to a sanctioning nation. Of course, the whole point of the shadow fleet is that it enables Russia to sell its oil and fuel to nations that haven't placed it under sanctions, such as China and India. But both of those countries will be licking their lips at the lower price cap. They know they have leverage over Russia, meaning they can tell Russia's oil sellers that they want discounts or they won't buy. Russia has to offer those discounts. And when the cost of shipping a single barrel is rising because of these insurance issues, those discounts make it much harder for Russia to turn a profit from its oil and fuel sales. Russia ends up either having to ship its oil at very close to a loss or give up on selling altogether, which it's already doing with its gasoline and diesel. The effects of this decline in seaborne trade are clear, Maritime press says. September alone saw a total decline of 153 million barrels that would have been sold via seaborne shipping routes. The outlet claims that this amounts to $12 billion gone in a single month, because Russia either can't or won't ship as much by sea as it has in the past. We touched on Russia imposing bans on gasoline and diesel sales a moment ago. There's a big reason why that's happening, and it comes back to Ukraine's devastating refinery strikes. To deliver the third major outcome of what Ukraine is doing, Russia is struggling with a domestic fuel crisis. Beyond the export bans, which have the obvious effect of limiting the amount of revenue that Russia can generate from its refined oil sales, Russia is also being forced to limit the amount of fuel that it's selling to its own people. RBC Ukraine reported on these limitations on October 21st, noting that 3 more Russian regions have imposed restrictions on fuel sales, adding to several others that imposed similar restrictions in September and early in October. It says that the restrictions affect all gas stations owned by the Baikal regional company that operate in the Irkutsk, Buryatia, and Zabakalsky Krai regions of Russia. Now, drivers in those regions can only buy a maximum of 20 liters of AI-92 gasoline per person, which likely isn't even enough to fill a quarter of a tank. Baikal is supplied by Rosneft and Gazprom, which are two of Russia's largest energy companies, and it says that it's been forced to impose the limits because fuel deliveries from those companies have been disrupted. Baikal didn't offer a timeline for when it will lift its restrictions. Right now, the measures are indefinite. Baikal isn't the only Russian gas station network to impose these restrictions. The Kors network has done the same in the regions in which it operates, and according to RBC Ukraine, gasoline shortages have now been reported in 57 of Russia's regions. This isn't a local problem, it's nationwide, and it's happening because Ukraine keeps on taking out the refineries that supply the fuel that Russian citizens need for their vehicles. Queues are growing, supplies are running out, and customers are having to pay more for their fuel than ever before. This is an entirely different aspect of Ukraine's strategy. Leaving Russia with less oil and fuel products to sell overseas takes a massive bite out of the revenue Putin can tax to fund his Ukraine war. But with everyday Russian citizens being affected by the shortages Ukraine has created, Putin faces the potentially much more dangerous problem of dealing with internal strife. That strife may not cause the average Russian to want to overthrow Putin, however, it may end up being enough to put pressure on Putin to end the invasion that he started. Ukraine, of course, isn't going to stop. The refineries that are within its range are going to continue being hit as hard and as often as possible. Now those refineries are as strained as they are, Ukraine is also increasingly turning its attention to Russia's fuel depots. With Russia's refineries out of action, depots have now become prime targets, where fuel waits before being loaded onto ships or trains. Footage and satellite images show large depot fires and damaged rail storage sites, Euromaidan press reports. This is clever by Ukraine. It knows that it can hit Russia's refineries, and after so many successful strikes, it also knows that Russia doesn't appear to have the air defenses it needs to stop those kinds of strikes. Ukraine can now watch and wait, observing Russia's repair efforts before it launches follow-up attacks to take any restarted refineries back offline. In the meantime, it will focus on the fuel that Russia already has. Taking out depots destroys fuel that Russia has already earmarked for a purpose, be that selling overseas, selling domestically, or providing to its troops in Ukraine. Stockpiled fuel going up in flames can't be replaced as readily thanks to Ukraine's refinery strikes, which means Ukraine has Russia in a stranglehold. It's taken out the means of production. Now it's taking out the product itself. For Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky, the refinery strikes and the impact they're having on Russia are all about bringing Putin crashing back down to reality. Putin had Russia's people fooled into thinking that the Ukraine invasion wouldn't cause any adverse effects back home. Now Ukraine is proving that to be a lie. There has been an increase both in the range and in the accuracy of our long-range sanctions against Russia. Practically every day or two, Russian oil refineries are being hit, Euromaidan press reported Zelensky as saying during his October 19th daily address to Ukraine. The strikes are bringing Russia back to reality, Ukraine's president added, and Ukraine now plans to respond to every long-range Russian strike with military actions of its own. Our capabilities will be broadened, Zelensky added. And that means that Russia will soon be facing more intense, numerous and powerful refinery and depot strikes as Ukraine builds and improves its long-range drone and missile arsenals. Ukraine's ultimate goal is to bring about the collapse of Russia's oil and fuel industries. That collapse may be closer than Putin wants to admit. On October 21st, the Atlantic Council published an article claiming that Putin's war machine may finally be running out of fuel. In addition to highlighting several of the issues discussed in this video, the Council says that an assessment conducted by the IEA suggests that Ukraine's refinery strikes will suppress Russia's refining rate until at least mid-2026. If Ukraine's capabilities are expanding, as Zelensky suggests, mid-2026 may be an optimistic estimate. Russia is also going to inflict more pain on its people by raising its VAT rate from 20% to 22% in a desperate effort to cover the gaps in the Russian budget being caused by Ukraine's refinery strikes. That feeds back into the point we made earlier about causing discontent among the Russian people. They won't want to hear that the fuel they buy, along with everything else to which VAT applies, is going to become more expensive when they're queuing in the cold for their rations of gasoline. Russia is now also being forced to prioritize where its remaining fuel goes, which is a problem that it really hasn't faced at any other point during the war. The Kyiv Insider notes that this prioritization would have to happen if Ukraine ever managed to take out between 40 and 50% of Russia's refining capacity. Russia is at that point now, and we can already see that the military is the priority. But even with Russia focusing on its troops ahead of its people, so many refineries being offline is bound to hurt the country's war effort. Operationally, the strain will be unmistakable. Reduced aviation sorties, fewer large-scale offensives, and slower logistics are all foreseeable outcomes, the Kyiv Insider says. It also claims that assuming Ukraine maintains its current pace and strength of refinery assaults into 2026, Russia will reach the point where it's structurally dependent on crude oil exports to generate revenue. Crude oil sells for less than refined oil products, and the price cap issues we mentioned earlier will truly start to sting when Russia reaches this point. The situation in Russia is getting desperate. A collapse is coming, and it's one from which the country may not recover for years. Russia's response to all of this has been to attempt to give Ukraine a dose of its own medicine. On October 21st, the Kyiv Independent reported that Russia has intensified its strikes on Ukraine's energy sector and has been encouraged to do so as Ukraine's hope of receiving Tomahawk missiles from the US fades. These infrastructure strikes are being designed to force Ukraine's civilians to deal with the upcoming cold months without the heating they need, and Zelensky has been quick to point out threats and pressure are needed to counter these intensified assaults. Just a few weeks ago, Putin was under real pressure and facing the threat of Tomahawk cruise missiles, and he immediately showed a willingness to return to diplomacy. But as soon as that pressure eased even slightly, the Russians began backing away from diplomacy and trying to delay dialogue, Zelensky claimed. It's all going to come down to which side breaks first. Russia's energy infrastructure strikes have a more direct impact on Ukraine's civilians, though they are tragically used to Russia's attempts to hurt them. Ukraine's refinery strikes, though impacting Russia's civilians indirectly, are more focused on pulling money out of Putin's war machine. Ukraine will hope that this approach wears Russia down fast enough to bring the war to an end. And, due to the ticking time bomb of Russia's economy, it may only have to last for another 18 months. That's how long Russia has until its entire economy comes falling down. Find out more in our video and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more coverage of the impact of Ukraine's refinery strike strategy. And thank you as always for watching.